The man who rode into Eliza Blackwell's yard on a Tuesday morning in the autumn of 1874 was bleeding so badly that she first mistook the dark stain spreading across his shirt for shadow. She had been hanging laundry on the line strung between two cottonwood trees at the edge of her property in Sweetwater Valley, Colorado Territory, when she heard the horse. It was a fine animal, a deep chestnut with a white blaze down its nose, moving with the uncertain gait of a creature that sensed its rider was in distress. The man on top of it was slumped forward, his wide-brimmed hat pulled low, both hands gripping the saddle horn with the white-knuckled desperation of someone who had been holding on for a very long time and was nearly finished doing so. Eliza dropped the wet sheet she was holding and walked toward the horse with deliberate calm, the way her mother had taught her to approach frightened animals and wounded men alike. She reached up and caught the bridle, speaking softly to the horse while she studied the man slumped over its neck. He was broad through the shoulders, lean at the hip, with dark hair curling slightly at the collar of his flannel shirt. The shirt itself was soaked through on the left side, rust brown going to black where the wound was worst. "Sir," she said. "Sir, can you hear me?" He made a sound, not quite a word, but enough to tell her he was still on the right side of living. "I'm going to help you down," she said. "You need to let go of that horn." She was 24 years old and had spent the better part of the last 2 years running her father's homestead alone since consumption had taken him the previous winter. She was not a large woman, but she was strong in the way that women who do not have the luxury of weakness become strong, with wiry arms and a back that knew how to bear weight. She managed to get the stranger's boot out of the stirrup and his arm over her shoulder before his legs gave entirely, and she walked him, half dragging, through the door of her small house and onto the narrow cot she kept in the back room that had been her father's sick room and had never fully stopped being one. He collapsed onto it, and she got a good look at him for the first time in the thin afternoon light that came through the single window. He was perhaps 30, or close to it. The face was weathered in the particular way of men who spent their days outdoors, with fine lines at the corners of his eyes and the bridge of his nose reddened by sun and wind. The jaw was strong and dark with several days of stubble. Even collapsed and bloodless-looking, there was something settled about him, something that suggested this was a man who, in ordinary circumstances, did not find himself helpless anywhere. She cut his shirt away without ceremony, because she had learned from watching her father's last months that modesty was a luxury the sick could not afford. The wound was a gunshot wound. She was fairly certain of it. A small entry hole just below his left ribs with no exit that she could find, which was the more dangerous situation. She had tended gunshot wounds before, once on a passing trapper who had shot himself in the foot with his own rifle, and once on old Hector Greenlee who had been on the wrong end of a dispute over a fence line. Both times she had sent to town for the doctor. The nearest town, Copper Ridge, was 14 miles east, and this man would not last 14 miles. She worked with what she had. She boiled water on the iron stove, tore clean cloth into strips, and used a thin knife she kept sterile in a jar of carbolic solution her father's doctor had recommended. The bullet had lodged against a rib, close enough to the surface that she could feel it through the skin when she pressed carefully. She had to make the wound a little worse before she could make it better, and she did it with steady hands and a prayer she was not entirely sure she believed in anymore, working by the light of a kerosene lamp as the afternoon went to evening. She got the bullet out. She cleaned the wound thoroughly, packed it with clean cloth soaked in the carbolic solution, and bound it tight. By the time she was finished, her own hands were trembling, and she sat down on the edge of the cot for a moment, just breathing, while the stranger's chest rose and fell with a steadiness that was already more reliable than it had been an hour ago. She did not know his name. There was nothing in his coat pockets that told her one, just a worn leather glove, a small folding knife, and a handful of cartridges for a revolver she found holstered at his hip. She set the revolver on the high shelf above the window where it would be out of immediate reach but not difficult for her to get to if she needed it. She did not think she would need it. Whatever trouble this man had ridden away from, he had not brought it to her door in the form of other armed men, and she was grateful for that. She fed the horse from her own small store of hay and put it in the linta beside the house, where she kept her 2 milk cows and her father's old mule. It was a very good horse, even she could tell that, with legs like iron columns and that kind, steady eye that marked the difference between an animal that had been well treated and one that had not. She sat up through the first night. The man ran a fever by midnight, which she had expected. She pressed cool, wet cloths to his forehead and neck and kept the blankets light, checking the wound every hour for the yellow seep of infection. He was restless in the fever, turning his head and speaking in fragments she could not quite piece together. She heard a name, maybe 2 names. She heard the word cattle several times. Once he said something that sounded like valley, and once, clearly enough that she could not mistake it, he said water. She lifted his head and helped him drink from a tin cup, and he subsided again. By the second morning the fever had not broken, but it had not climbed higher either, and she thought that was a hopeful sign. She managed to get a little thin broth into him, the kind she had made for her father in his worst spells, just beef bones simmered long with a little salt and whatever herbs she had dried over the summer. He swallowed it reflexively, which was another good sign, because it meant some part of him still understood the business of staying alive. She had her own work to do. The cows needed milking. The garden still had the last of the autumn squash to bring in before the frost that was already threatening each morning in a thin white skim along the fence posts. She did it all with one eye on the house, moving quickly, returning often to check on him. She had a neighbor, a widow woman named Mrs. Prentice who lived 3 miles west, and she considered sending word to her, but the trail between them had been soft mud since the last rain, and she did not want to ask Mrs. Prentice to make that ride just to watch over a stranger. On the afternoon of the second day, he opened his eyes. They were gray-green, the color of the sage on the hillsides after rain, and they were confused in the way of people who have been somewhere dark and are not entirely sure they have come all the way back. He looked at the ceiling first, then at the window, then at her where she sat in the wooden chair beside the cot with a mending basket on her knees. "Where is this?" His voice came out rough and low. "My house," she said, setting the mending aside. "You rode in 2 days ago in a bad way. I have done what I could for you." He tried to push himself up and she put a hand on his shoulder. "Do not," she said, firmly but not unkindly. "You will open that wound again, and I would prefer not to spend another night with my hands inside you." The ghost of something crossed his face. She thought it might have been humor, but it was too weak and fleeting to be certain. "The bullet," he said. "I took it out." He was quiet for a moment. "You took it out yourself." "There was no one else to do it," she said. "The nearest doctor is 14 miles, and you would not have made 14 miles. So yes, I took it out myself. You are welcome." This time the ghost was definitely humor. It made him look younger, or perhaps simply more like whatever he actually was beneath the pain and the pallor. "I am welcome," he repeated as if testing the phrase. "Yes, thank you, I am sorry, I am not at my best for manners just now." "I had noticed that," she said. "Can you drink something? There is broth." "Water first," he said, "please." She gave him water, then broth, and he managed both better than she had expected. Color was beginning to return to his face slowly, the way color returns to a landscape after a long winter, tentative at first and then with more conviction. "What is your name?" she asked when he had settled back, and the lines of pain around his eyes had eased slightly. He was quiet for a moment that went on a beat longer than it should have, and she filed that pause away without commenting on it. "Calloway," he said. "Silas Calloway." "Eliza Blackwell," she said. "This is my father's homestead. My father passed last winter. I have been managing it alone since." He looked at her with those gray-green eyes, and she had the impression of being seen quite clearly, more clearly than she was accustomed to with strangers. "Alone," he said, as if it surprised him. "I am capable," she said. "I did not doubt it," he said. You took a bullet out with your own hands. Are you going to tell me how you came to have a bullet put in you?" she asked. The pause came again. "Not today," he said. "If that is all right." She considered pressing the matter. She had a right to know, she thought, given that she had spent 2 days and nights keeping this man alive and could not afford to be caught in the middle of someone else's trouble. But he looked genuinely exhausted, and the wound was her first concern, and the whole truth or even part of it could wait for when he was stronger. "Today you will rest," she said, and returned to her mending. The days that followed took on a shape she had not anticipated. Silas Calloway was a surprisingly straightforward patient, which is to say, he was not a good patient at all in the conventional sense, but he was a consistent one. He did not complain about the pain except by a tightening of his jaw that she learned to read the way she read weather. He pushed against rest with the stubborn insistence of a man who was not accustomed to stillness and did not entirely trust it. He ate everything she brought him with a gratitude that was somehow more genuine for being quiet. A nod, a look, sometimes just the way he held the empty bowl as if he was reluctant to give it back. By the third day he was sitting up for stretches. By the fourth he was insisting on being helped to the chair, which she allowed because arguing with him required more energy than simply making sure he did not fall. By the fifth day he was at the window, watching the yard with an attention that seemed to go beyond simple convalescent restlessness. "You are looking for something," she said, coming to stand beside him with a fresh cup of coffee, which she had determined was a more effective medicine than anything else she had in her cabinet. He accepted the coffee. "Just looking," he said. "That is a valley worth looking at," she said, following his gaze out across the broad sweep of land beyond her fence line, the golden grass running up to the foot of the dark-timbered hills, the line of cottonwoods marking the creek that ran year-round, the far mountains going purple against the pale autumn sky. Something moved in his face when she said that, something complicated and private. "It is," he said. "It is worth a great deal, that valley." She had heard talk of the valley, of course. Everyone in the territory had heard talk of Sweetwater Valley, which was among the best grazing land in all of Colorado Territory, watered by the creek that never ran dry even in the worst drought years, with winter shelter in the hills and summer grass that went knee-high on a good horse. The valley had been the subject of dispute since settlers began arriving in earnest after the war, with homesteaders pressing against the edges and the big cattle outfits pushing back, and in the middle of it, all a name that came up whenever men talked about the valley in tones that were equal parts respect and wariness. Calloway Ranch. Silas Calloway, they said, owned the heart of it, had built his operation from next to nothing in the years after the war and had become one of the largest landholders in the territory. A man whose handshake was a contract and whose patience, once exhausted, was not restored. She had not connected the name when he gave it to her, partly because she had been too focused on keeping him alive to think about much else, and partly because the man lying on her father's cot with a bullet wound and a fever had not seemed like any version of the powerful figure she had heard described. He had seemed like a man in pain, which was its own kind of leveling. She still had not made the connection on the morning of the fifth day as they stood at the window together with their coffee. He was still a stranger to her, strange and interesting, and she was increasingly aware that she wanted him to stay strange and interesting for a while longer, which was a thought she had not had about anyone in some time. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You have been in my house for 5 days," she said. "I think you have earned asking." "The ranch to the north of your fence line," he said. "Do you know who holds that ground?" She looked at him curiously. The ground to the north of her fence line was part of the lower pasture of the Calloway spread. She knew it by its branded cattle, a wide circle with a C inside that she saw sometimes through the fence when the herd grazed down to the lower pastures. "Calloway Ranch holds it," she said. "Why?" The expression on his face was one she would think about later, something between careful and amused, something that was holding something back. "Just getting my bearings," he said. "I have been in and out of this county for some time. I was not certain exactly where I had landed." You landed in the south quarter of the valley, she said. My father homesteaded this parcel 12 years ago. We have been here ever since, or I have. There are a dozen other homesteads along the creek line, but this is the southernmost of them. You said your father passed last winter, he said. He turned from the window to look at her directly, and she found herself meeting his eyes without the shield of distraction she had been using for the past 5 days. It was a disconcerting experience. You have been running this place alone since then. Do you intend to stay on it? The question was direct enough to be almost rude, but his tone was not rude, just genuinely curious in a way that had nothing of judgment in it. It is my land, she said simply. My father is buried here. Where else would I go? He looked at her for a long moment. Where else indeed, he said quietly, and turned back to the window. On the 6th day he told her some of what had happened to him. He had been riding back from a meeting in Copper Ridge, he said, where he had been dealing with a complicated matter of land records and title disputes, which was apparently a common occupation in the territory. He had been alone, which he said was unusual for him because he normally rode with at least one hand from his outfit. He had taken the high trail back because the creek crossing was flooded from the recent rains, and the high trail went through a stretch of timber that was not entirely safe territory these days. He said this last part with a careful neutrality that told her plenty. 3 men had been waiting in the timber. He did not know them, or said he did not know them, though the careful way he said it suggested he might have a strong suspicion. They had not announced their intention in advance the way honest men in honest disputes tended to do. They had simply opened fire, and one of the shots had found him, and he had spurred his horse and ridden hard, and the horse had brought him here. Why did they want to shoot you? She asked. There are men in this county who would benefit from certain land disputes being resolved in a particular way, he said. Men who do not care to wait for the legal process to resolve them. That is a careful way of saying you have enemies who tried to kill you, she said. Yes, he said, it is. Have you told me the whole of it? Those gray-green eyes were steady on her face. No, he said, but I have told you what matters for your safety. No one followed me here, I am certain of that. Your household is not in danger on my account. She believed him, or at least she believed that he believed it, which was near enough. Then we will leave the rest of it for another time, she said, and meant it. On the 7th day she let him walk to the yard with her help, just to the fence and back, 10 minutes in the cool morning air. He moved carefully, with one hand pressed to his ribs and his face set against the pane, but he moved. And by the time they got back to the house, some of the color that had been returning had deepened into something that looked more like health than its imitation. He stopped at the fence and looked out across the yard, past the garden to the open land beyond. The light was the particular gold of a Colorado autumn morning, thick and rich as something poured, and it lay across the valley in a way that made even the ordinary look extraordinary. This is beautiful land, he said. Yes, she agreed. Your father chose well. He did, she said. He used to sit on the porch in the evenings and say that a man could not ask for a finer view to end a day on. I think he was right. Silas turned to look at her, and there was something in his expression that she had not seen there before, something warmer and more vulnerable than the careful, contained quality he had shown her so far. You miss him, he said. Every day, she said, without apology or self-consciousness, because it was simply true. I lost my father young, he said. My mother, too, not long after. I understand that kind of absence. It was the most personal thing he had volunteered since he had told her his name, and she recognized it for the gift it was, a man who held his private things close, choosing to share one of them. Then you know, she said, that you do not really stop missing them. You just get better at carrying it. Yes, he said, that is exactly right. They stood together at the fence for another minute, in a silence that was comfortable rather than empty, before she guided him back inside and made him rest, which he did for once without argument. That evening, while she sat at the small table working on the accounts she kept for the homestead, a careful log of expenses, an income that she maintained with the same precision her father had. She heard him moving on the cot. She looked up to find him lying on his back with his eyes open, staring at the ceiling. "You are not sleeping," she observed. "I am thinking," he said. "What about?" Another pause. But this one felt different from the earlier ones, less like concealment and more like a man deciding how much truth to bring out into the light. "About what I owe you," he said. She set her pen down. "You owe me nothing," she said. "I did what any decent person would do." "You did considerably more than that," he said. "You took a bullet out of a stranger with your own hands. You have fed me and nursed me and kept me alive for a week. That is not nothing. That is not something I know how to repay with a simple thank you." "Then do not try to repay it," she said. "Just get well." "Eliza," he said, and the sound of her given name in his voice, low and careful as he had said it, did something she was not entirely prepared for, a warmth that started somewhere in the center of her chest and spread outward. "I am going to get well. And when I do, I would like to find a proper way to thank you. Not because I feel I owe a debt, though I do, but because—" He stopped. "Because," she said. He turned his head on the pillow to look at her across the small room, and the lamplight caught the gray-green of his eyes and made them something more than she had a word for. "Because I find that I do not particularly want this to be over," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up her pen again. "Neither do I," she said quietly, and returned to her accounts. He was strong enough to come to the table for meals by the 9th day. The act of sitting across from her at the small table that had been her father's, and eating from the plain white dishes that had been her mother's, brought something into the room, not an awkwardness but a rightness, a domestic intimacy that neither of them commented on directly but that was present between them like a third person at the table. He was an interesting man to talk to, she was discovering. He knew things in a way that made her think he had read widely and paid attention to what he read, which was not common, and he listened to what she said with the kind of focus that made her feel her words were worth the listening. He had opinions, sometimes strong ones, but he offered them as something to be considered rather than accepted, and when she argued back, which she did readily, he seemed genuinely pleased rather than put out. "Tell me about your cattle operation," she said one morning, testing the waters. He looked at her steadily. "What do you know about cattle?" he said. "More than you might expect," she said. "My father ran cattle before the homestead. I grew up on a ranch in Texas. We came north when I was 12. Something shifted in his expression. "Texas," he said. "Which part?" "Hill country originally, near Fredericksburg." My father was part German on his mother's side, which was not unusual in that part of Texas. "I know Fredericksburg," he said. "Beautiful country, the cedar and the live oak. You have been there." "I was born in Texas myself," he said. "East Texas, near Nacogdoches. I came west after the war." He said this last part with a flatness that marked it as a place he did not much want to dwell on, and she did not push. Many men who had come west after the war had come with wounds that were not visible, she knew. The territory was full of them, men who had seen things they were trying to walk away from. Her father had been one, though he had never talked about it, only sometimes woke in the night with sounds she was not supposed to hear. "My father fought for the Union," she said, offering it plainly. "Mine did not," Silas said, equally plain. "Does that trouble you?" "It was 9 years ago," she said. "The country decided to be one country again. I'm not going to undo that at my breakfast table." He looked at her with something that might have been gratitude. "No," he said, "I suppose not." The conversation moved on to cattle, and she found out that he was knowledgeable about the breed improvements being attempted with Longhorn and Shorthorn crosses, which she found genuinely interesting and said so. And he seemed surprised, and then pleased that she was interested, and they talked about it for a long while until the coffee was cold and the morning was fully established around them. She did not tell him what she had begun to understand about who he was. She was not certain precisely when it had come clear in her mind, somewhere between the 7th and 9th days, piecing it together from the things he said carefully and the things he said without thinking. The land, the cattle, the county politics, the name. She had not confronted him with it because she was not sure what confronting him with it would accomplish, and because some part of her wanted to understand why he had not told her himself. It was Mrs. Prentice who clarified everything. On the 10th day, the widow Prentice came riding up the trail on her solid brown mare, which she did every few weeks to share news and borrow or return small items that neighbors in isolated country traded back and forth as a matter of practical survival. She tied her horse at the fence and came to the door, and Eliza met her there, stepping outside to speak with her before she could walk in and see the man at the table. But she was too slow. Mrs. Prentice, who was a stout, sharp-eyed woman of 60 with no patience for being kept on doorsteps, had already looked past her. "Eliza Blackwell," she said, in a tone that packed considerable meaning into 2 words, "is that Silas Calloway sitting at your table?" Eliza felt something cold and something hot move through her at the same time. She turned. Silas was at the table, his coffee cup in front of him, watching the doorway with an expression that had gone carefully still. "You know him?" Eliza said. Mrs. Prentice made a sound that managed to be both incredulous and amused. "Knows him? Child, everyone in this valley knows Silas Calloway. He owns it." She stepped past Eliza and into the house, looking at Silas with the frank appraisal of a woman who has seen enough of life to be afraid of very little of it. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "you look like you have had a time of it." "Mrs. Prentice," he said, and his voice was steady and even, but his eyes had moved past her to Eliza. Eliza stood in the doorway. The valley, Sweetwater Valley. She thought of the way he had looked out the window on the 5th day, his eyes moving across the land with something that was more than a stranger's admiration. She thought of the careful pauses. She thought of him saying, "It is worth a great deal, that valley," and the complicated thing in his face when she had named the Calloway spread. "She owns it." No, he owned it. She looked at him and he looked back at her, and there was a conversation happening between their eyes that had no words in it but was perfectly clear. "Mrs. Prentice," Eliza said, finding her manners from somewhere that felt very far away, "let me get you some coffee." The widow Prentice stayed for the better part of an hour, which felt to Eliza considerably longer than that. She talked about the town, about the weather, about a dispute between 2 homesteaders 3 miles east over water rights, about the new minister who had arrived in Copper Ridge and was apparently too young for the congregation's taste. Through all of it, she looked between Eliza and Silas with the attentive curiosity of a woman who understood perfectly that she had walked into the middle of something and was thoroughly entertained by the fact. When she finally left, the silence she left behind was different from the comfortable silences that had grown up between them over the past 10 days. This one had a quality of waiting in it. Eliza sat down at the table. She put her hands flat on the worn wood surface and looked at him. "Silas Calloway," she said, "who owns this valley?" "Who owns the greater part of this valley," he said carefully. "Your parcel is your own, free and clear. Your father's homestead claim is legitimate and your title is sound. I would not have it otherwise." "That is not the point," she said. "No," he said. "The point is that I did not tell you." "Why did you not tell me?" He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was low and considered, the voice of a man choosing his words not to deceive but to be precise. "When I came here, I was barely conscious," he said. "And when I was conscious enough to speak, I gave you my name. I gave you my real name. I did not hide that." "You did not correct my impression," she said. "No," he admitted. "I did not, and I have been thinking about why these past days." He turned the coffee cup in his hands, a motion that she recognized as something he did when he was thinking. "When I am Silas Calloway, who owns Calloway Ranch and half of Sweetwater Valley, people behave in a particular way around me. They want things from me, or they are afraid of me, or they resent me, and I understand all of those things and I have learned to manage them. But you," he stopped. He looked at her with those gray-green eyes, direct and undefended. "You brought me in as a stranger who needed help. You talked to me as a man, not a name. And I found that I did not want to trade that for whatever would replace it, not yet, not until I understood what it was. Eliza looked at him for a long time. She wanted to be angry. She could feel the shape of righteous anger available to her, the anger of a woman who had been kept in the dark, who had made herself vulnerable by caring for someone who had held back a significant truth. It would have been a reasonable anger. But she thought about the pauses, and how he had filled them not with lies but with careful truths, and she thought about the way he had looked at the valley from her window, and she thought about what he had said the evening before. I find that I do not particularly want this to be over. And she understood, not entirely comfortably, that she had done the same thing. She had known or suspected from the 9th day, and she had not asked directly because she had not wanted what they had built in those 10 days to be disturbed by it. They had both been protecting something. "You should have told me," she said finally. "Yes," he said without qualification. "I should have. I am sorry, Eliza." Her name again in that careful voice. She pressed her palms harder against the table. "Are you going to be difficult about any of this?" she asked. "About my land, I mean." "About the homestead?" The question seemed to genuinely surprise him. "No," he said with a certainty that rang entirely true. "Your father's claim is legitimate. Your land is yours. I have never moved against legitimate homestead claims. That is not the kind of man I am." He paused. "Though I understand why you might wonder." "The men in the timber," she said, "the ones who shot you, are they connected to someone who wants to push the homesteaders out?" He looked at her steadily. "Possibly," he said. "There are parties in this county who would benefit from clearing the lower pastures. I have been in conflict with those parties for the better part of 2 years. I do not know yet who sent those men, but I intend to find out. And when you find out, then I will handle it through the law," he said. "And if the law is insufficient, I will handle it in whatever way is necessary, but not by threatening women on their own land. Never that." She believed him. She believed him in the bone-deep way that she had learned to trust in the years since her father died, when she had become very good at distinguishing between the kind of man who meant what he said and the kind who made his words into tools. "All right," she said. "All right," he repeated. "All right, I accept your apology," she said. "You should have told me. You know you should have. But I understand why you did not, and I am not going to hold it over you forever. That is not how I choose to be." Something released in his face, something she had not fully registered, was tensed until she saw at ease. "You are a remarkable woman, Eliza Blackwell," he said quietly. "I am a practical one," she said, which sometimes looks like remarkable from the outside, but she was not quite able to keep the warmth out of her voice when she said it. Over the next several days, as he continued to mend, and the nature of who he was settled into the ordinary texture of their days, she watched for the change she had feared, the shift in dynamic that would come with knowing. She watched to see if he would become someone else now that the pretense was dropped, if the warmth and the directness and the careful attention would be replaced by the manner of a powerful man in whose charity she was temporarily situated. It did not happen. He remained, as far as she could tell, the same man. Possibly more so, because there was a relief in him now that the concealment was dropped, a loosening, as if he had been holding something in and could breathe more fully without it. He talked to her with the same frank interest. He listened with the same quality of attention. He helped her with what small things he was able to do from the chair as his strength returned, shelling dried beans, mending a piece of harness with the practiced hands of a man who had done such work all his life, reading to her from the small collection of books her father had kept on the shelf above the fireplace when the light was not good enough for her own eyes. He had a good reading voice, low and measured, with a rhythm that made even dry prose feel like something worth listening to. She sat and sewed by the fire on those evenings and thought that she could get very used to this. It was a dangerous thought. She was clear-eyed enough to know it was dangerous, not because there was anything threatening about the man, but because she had not allowed herself to want things for 2 years, not since her father's death had reduced the future to a series of immediate practical concerns, and wanting things again opened you to loss again, which was its own kind of risk. She wanted this anyway. On the 14th day, he walked unassisted from the house to the fence and back twice, and the second time he was barely careful at all. He stood in the yard afterward with his face turned to the sun, his eyes closed, and for a moment he looked simply glad to be alive in a way that was uncomplicated by anything else. She watched him from the porch. "You are going to leave soon," she said. It was not a question. He opened his eyes and turned to look at her. "I have responsibilities that have been waiting long enough," he said. "My ranch, my men. The matter of those 3 men in the timber which needs to be resolved before someone else gets hurt." "I know," she said. "I do not want to go," he said. "I know that too," she said. He walked to the porch steps and stopped there looking up at her. He was still slightly pale, still careful with that left side, but he was recognizably himself in a way that he had not been when he first came, the solid presence of a man who was usually in command of whatever space he occupied. "I have been thinking about what I said," he told her, "about not wanting this to be over." "Have you?" she said. "I meant it," he said, "and I would like to say something more direct if you will allow me." "I generally prefer direct," she said. The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. "I know that about you," he said. "It is one of the things He started again. "Eliza, I would like to come back and call on you, properly. As a man who is interested in a woman, not as a patient who has worn out his welcome." She looked at him for a long moment. The autumn light was in his hair and the yard around them smelled of dry grass and the last of the season's warmth, and she thought, with something that felt very much like joy, that her father had been right about this view. "You have not worn out your welcome," she said. "But yes, come back and call on me, Silas Calloway, properly." He smiled then, a full smile that she had not seen from him before, and it changed his face entirely, made it younger and open and warm in a way that she felt like a small shock in the center of her chest. "I will," he said. "I promise you that." He left the following morning with a fresh shirt she gave him from her father's chest, which fit him reasonably well across the shoulders, and with his wound redressed and the carbolic solution in a small jar, she pressed on him, along with very specific instructions about cleaning the wound daily, that he received with a gravity that told her he would follow them. He saddled his chestnut horse in the yard while she stood on the porch. He tied on the small pack she had assembled for him, supplies for the ride back to the ranch. Before he mounted, he came back to the porch and stood at the foot of the steps. "Thank you," he said, "for all of it. Ride carefully," she said, "and send word when you are back safely." He looked at her for a moment longer, then nodded and mounted with only the briefest flinch that told her the ribs were still sore, which they would be for some time yet. She watched him ride north until he was a small shape against the big country, and then he was gone, and the yard was very quiet. She went inside and stood for a moment in the small back room where the cot still held the shape of him, the blankets pressed down, and the indentation in the old pillow, and then she straightened the blankets briskly and went to get on with the day's work. He sent word 3 days later, a note brought by one of his hands, a young man of perhaps 22 named Tucker, who tipped his hat with great seriousness and informed her that Mr. Calloway was home and doing well and sent his regards. The note itself was brief and said only that he had arrived safely, that he was grateful, and that he would come as soon as business allowed. Business allowed sooner than she had expected. He was back at her door 8 days later on a Saturday, with no bullet wound and no horse-delivered crisis, but with a clean shirt and a carefully shaved jaw and a small bunch of late wild asters that he held with the slightly self-conscious manner of a man who had not often brought a woman flowers. She looked at the flowers and then at him. "I found them by the creek," he said. "They are lovely," she said. "Come in. There is coffee." The first proper call was, by any measure, a success, which is to say that 2 hours passed in what felt like 20 minutes, and when he stood to leave, there was a reluctance on both sides that filled the room like a living thing. He came the following Saturday as well, and the one after that, and by the 4th Saturday she had stopped being surprised to see him, and had started being surprised by how much she was aware of the days between. He was working through the trouble of the men in the timber. He told her about it over those Saturdays, in careful pieces, because he was not a man who aired his difficulties readily, but he was learning, she thought, to trust that she was not going to be damaged by the weight of them. It turned out that the men had been connected to a speculator out of Denver named Aldrich Holt, who had been attempting to acquire land in the valley through various pressures, legal and otherwise, and who had evidently decided that Silas Calloway was the principal obstacle to those acquisitions. Silas had brought the matter before the county sheriff and the territorial land office with the methodical thoroughness of a man who had learned that the law was a useful tool when properly applied. And the three men themselves, she asked one afternoon. Two were apprehended, he said. The third left the territory. I am content to leave him be, given that he is leaving. And Holt is dealing with the territorial authorities and a very effective attorney I engaged in Denver, Silas said, with a satisfaction that was not quite a smile but was close to one. He will not be troubling this valley further. Good, she said simply. He looked at her. You are not going to ask me to be more lenient, to let the matter go, forgive and forget. Why would I do that, she said. They shot you. They were threatening homesteaders all through this valley. Being lenient would put people in danger. He shook his head slightly, the way he did sometimes when she said something that surprised him with its directness. You are something else, Eliza Blackwell. I have been telling you that, she said. November came in cold and sharp, and the Saturdays became Saturdays and the occasional Wednesday, and then they became simply days when he came and days when he did not, with the days when he did not increasingly feeling like the interruption rather than the other way around. He brought her practical things alongside the flowers, once a bag of good coffee that she had been stretching too thin, once a repair to the fence along the north side that she had not asked for but needed badly, done quietly one morning while she was occupied with the milking, and noted only by the fact that the fence was suddenly straight and solid where it had been leaning for 2 months. She baked bread for him on the Saturdays, and a molasses cake that became an understood tradition, and she mended the tear in his coat one afternoon while he sat across from her reading from the newspaper he had brought from Copper Ridge, and neither of them commented on the domestic ease of any of it, because commenting would have required acknowledging what it was, and they were, by some unspoken agreement, approaching it carefully, the way you approach something that matters. It was a Sunday in late November when it became something that had to be named. He had ridden over with the newspaper and stayed through the afternoon, and the light was going to the long amber of winter evening, and they were sitting by the fire with the easy silence of people who have been talking for hours and have simply paused when he said without preamble, I should tell you something. She set down her sewing. Then tell me. I have been married before, he said. My wife passed 6 years ago, fever. We did not have children. He paused. I tell you this because I do not want you to be surprised by it, and because it is part of who I am, and you have been honest with me, and I should be entirely honest with you. She looked at the fire for a moment. Thank you for telling me, she said. Does it change anything, he asked, and she heard in the question the particular vulnerability of a man who did not often ask such things. No, she said. It tells me that you are a man who has loved someone and lost them and kept going anyway, which is something I understand. She met his eyes. It does not change anything. The fire shifted and settled between them. Eliza, he said, I think you know what I am trying to say to you. I think I do, she said. I think you might want to say it clearly anyway. He moved from the chair across from her to the chair beside her, the one that had been her father's, and he took her hand, which was the first time he had touched her since she had guided him around the yard in those early recovery days, and the difference between touching a patient and touching a person you want was as large as the difference between rain and the ocean. I am in love with you, he said. I have been for some time, and I would like, if you are willing, to ask you to be my wife. She looked at him for a long moment, this man who had come into her yard on a dying horse and had turned out to be the most interesting, infuriating, careful, warm person she had encountered in as long as she could remember. Yes, she said, I would like that very much. He looked at her as if he needed a moment to be certain she had said what he thought she had said, and then he brought her hand to his lips and kissed it, and then he leaned forward and kissed her properly, with a gentleness that held in it everything they had built over the past 2 months, the careful days and the Saturdays and the long conversations and the fire, all of it present in that single moment. When they drew back, she was aware of the peculiar sensation of a door opening onto a much larger room than the one she had been in. "I have a condition," she said. He looked at her, not alarmed but attentive. "My father's land," she said. "This homestead, it stays mine. It does not become part of Calloway Ranch just because we marry. My father worked 12 years for that title, and I have worked another 2, and it is mine in my own right." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I would not have it any other way." "You would not?" "No," he said. "It is yours. It has always been yours. I think you should know that the thought of taking it from you would not occur to me, Eliza. That is not who I am." She studied him. She believed him. "All right," she said. "Then yes. My answer is yes, Silas, completely yes." The smile she had seen once before, the full open one that made him look young, broke across his face again, and she thought she would spend a great deal of her life enjoying that smile. They were married in the first week of January of 1875, in Copper Ridge, in the small white church that looked larger than it was because it stood against the sky at the edge of the main street. It was a modest ceremony in keeping with both their natures, witnesses provided by the minister's wife and Tucker the ranch hand, who stood very straight and looked deeply proud to be asked. Mrs. Prentice attended, having refused to be excluded with a firmness that neither of them had felt it wise to resist, and she wept with a cheerful lack of embarrassment throughout, and pronounced herself thoroughly satisfied with the outcome. The winter that followed was the warmest of Eliza's memory, which had nothing to do with the weather. She moved between the homestead and the ranch house, which sat 3 miles north on the high ground overlooking the valley, in a way that took some adjusting on both sides. The ranch house was larger than she was accustomed to, with 4 rooms and a proper kitchen, and a covered porch that ran the length of the front, and it held still the ghost of the life Silas had lived in it before, the careful absence of a woman who had not been forgotten so much as set carefully aside. She was not jealous of that history. She was, if anything, grateful for it, because the man she had married had been shaped by that love and by that loss in ways that had made him who he was, tender without being soft, careful of what he held, grateful for what remained. She brought things from her father's house, the books and the white dishes and the wooden chair and the portrait of her parents that hung in the parlor, and Silas made room for all of it without being asked, moving things, adjusting, making the house into something that contained both of them. She kept the homestead running, going down to see to the cows and the garden, and he respected this without comment. One of the younger ranch hands, a 16-year-old boy named Charlie who was desperately in need of steady employment, she engaged to help with the homestead chores in exchange for wages that Silas paid from the ranch accounts, with a cheerfulness that told her he found her management of this arrangement entirely admirable. By spring, she had learned the ranch's rhythms in addition to the homestead's. She learned the cattle operation, which was large and complex, and managed with an efficiency that impressed her, with 4 permanent hands and seasonal workers, and a system of pasture rotation that Silas had worked out over years of careful observation of the land. She learned the names of all the horses and most of the cattle. She learned where the creek was deepest and where it went shallow in the dry months, and where the best high pasture was, and where the winter shelter in the hills could hold 400 head if the storms came hard. She loved the valley. She had always loved it, since her father first brought her here at 12 years old, and she had stood on the back of the wagon and felt the land open around her like a held breath releasing. But she had loved it as one loves a thing that belongs to someone else, with the private and slightly aching love of the dispossessed. Now it was hers in a different way, or she was its in a different way, and the feeling of that was large and steady as the mountains that held the sky above it. Silas watched her learn the valley and the ranch with an attention that she felt without always catching directly. He offered knowledge when she asked for it and let her find her own way when she did not, which was exactly the right balance, and she thought sometimes that this was among the finest qualities he had, the ability to see clearly what kind of help was wanted and to give that and nothing more. They fought sometimes. They were two people with strong opinions and established habits, and friction was inevitable, the way friction is inevitable when two rivers join and have to find a common course. They fought about the best rotation for the south pasture, and about whether the price Silas had agreed to for the spring cattle sale was adequate, and once, with some heat, about a decision Silas made regarding one of the ranch hands that she thought was too harsh and he thought was necessary. On that last one she had been right, and he had acknowledged it within 2 days with the directness that she had come to rely on in him, not making a performance of the acknowledgement but simply saying quietly over coffee in the morning, "You were right about Martinez. I spoke to him differently and the matter is resolved. You see people clearly, Eliza." "So do you," she said, "when you are not being stubborn." "I am frequently being stubborn," he said. "I know," she said. "I have learned to work around it." He had taken her hand across the table and held it for a moment, just that, and it had been enough. The spring brought word that Aldrich Holt had been formally censured by the Territorial Land Office and had withdrawn from all pending land claims in Sweetwater Valley. The 3 men from the timber had been dealt with by the law, and the cloud that had hung over the valley's politics for 2 years lifted slowly, and then all at once the way clouds do. And the summer that followed was one of the best in recent memory, with rain enough and sun enough and the creek running clear and full through August. In the late summer, Eliza realized she was expecting a child. She told Silas in the evening, sitting on the front porch in the dusk, with the valley spread out below them going to purple and gold, and his face went through several things in rapid succession. Surprise and then a wonder so profound it was almost painful to look at, and then something that settled and steadied into an expression she had never seen on him before, the expression of a man whose world had just rearranged itself around a new center. He put his arm around her on the porch bench and held her against him, and she leaned into him and they sat together looking out at the valley in a silence that was the fullest she had ever known. "A child," he said finally, as if the word itself was something he was getting used to. "In the spring," she said, "or close to it. I am not certain of the exact time." "Are you well?" he asked, and the question was immediate and total in the way that told her it was the most important thing to him, that her health was the first fact and everything else came after. "I am very well," she said, "better than well." He pressed his lips to her hair and held her a little tighter, and she felt his breath go slowly out, a long exhale that released something she thought he had been holding for a very long time. The pregnancy was, as she had said, healthy. She was not a woman given to illness, and she approached the changes in her body with the practical curiosity she applied to most things, interested in what was happening and what it required of her. Silas was attentive in the specific way that told her he was paying close attention to everything without saying so all the time, the way the coffee appeared every morning without her having to ask for it, the way he quietly rearranged certain chores without making it into a discussion. She caught him once reading a medical pamphlet about childbirth that he had clearly obtained from somewhere, and he put it down with an expression that was both sheepish and utterly unashamed. "I like to be informed," he said. "I see that," she said, and loved him so much in that moment that she had to look away. She continued to help with the ranch work through the autumn and into the early winter, adapting as she needed to, and the ranch hands who had been slightly uncertain about her in the early months of the marriage had long since settled into a comfortable working respect. Tucker, who had been with Silas the longest, had become something close to a friend, and young Charlie from the homestead had grown 3 inches and learned to ride and was turning into a reliable hand who Silas had quietly begun to take more seriously. The baby was born in the first week of March of 1876, on a morning when the wind was still, and the light was coming in the bedroom window in long pale bars across the floor. He was a boy, strong and loud about his arrival, with Silas's dark hair and Eliza's blue eyes, and they named him Daniel Blackwell Calloway. Daniel for Eliza's father and Blackwell because she had asked, and Silas had agreed without hesitation that the name was worth keeping. Silas held his son for the first time with the careful certainty of a man who was afraid of very little but was afraid of this, of getting it wrong, of the small and absolute vulnerability of the thing in his arms. She watched him from the bed, exhausted and entirely present, and thought that she would carry this image of him for the rest of her life, this strong and complicated man holding something new and small and full of the future. "Hello, Daniel," Silas said, very quietly, as if they were being introduced. The baby blinked and settled against his chest, and the expression on Silas's face was the answer to every question she had ever had about what love looked like when it had nowhere left to hide. The years that built on that beginning were full and complicated, and rich in the way of lives genuinely lived. Daniel grew up in the valley that bore his family's name, riding by the time he was 4 with the easy seat of a child who had never known a world without horses, learning the cattle and the land from his father with the same methodical patience that Silas brought to everything, and learning the garden and the books and the stubbornness that would serve him well from his mother. 2 years after Daniel came a daughter they called Sarah, black-haired and bright-eyed, and possessed from the very beginning of an opinion about everything she encountered, which her parents received with a delight they occasionally tried to moderate and could not. Another 2 years brought a second son, James, who was quieter than either of his siblings and watched the world with the gray-green eyes that had been his father's first, and who would turn out to have a gift for the horses that Silas recognized and nurtured with a care that moved Eliza to watch. The homestead remained Eliza's. She maintained its title in her own name and kept it running, first with Charlie's help and later with the help of a family of German settlers she helped establish on the adjoining parcel, the Hotchbridgers, who became neighbors in the truest sense, people whose lives and work and table were intertwined with your own. She grew the garden larger and sold the surplus in Copper Ridge, and she kept the books for both the homestead and the ranch, which turned out to be a considerable and valuable thing that Silas received with the gratitude of a man who had been managing it adequately on his own, but recognized that adequately was not the same as well. The valley changed around them, as valleys do. More settlers came, and the town of Copper Ridge grew from a dusty main street to something with a proper school and a doctor's office, and eventually a telegraph station. The Calloway Ranch continued to be the largest operation in the valley, but Silas ran it without the isolation of the large operations that treated the surrounding community as a resource to be managed rather than a place to belong to. He hired from the community, bought from local suppliers, contributed to the school fund, and was regarded in the valley with the particular warm respect that is given to powerful men who have not used their power to diminish anyone. Eliza became something in the valley herself, not just as Silas Calloway's wife, but as her own established presence. She knew everyone's name and most of their children's birthdays. She kept a supply of the carbolic solution and the medical knowledge she had accumulated, and more than once she was the person summoned when the doctor was too far or too slow, working with the same steady hands and clear head that had once extracted a bullet from a stranger on her father's cot. There were injustices in the valley and in the territory that she and Silas both saw and contended with over the years. The Ute people whose land this had originally been were being pressed further and further from their territory by the forces of settlement and policy that neither she nor Silas had the individual power to stop, though they both found it troubling and said so in the public forums where such things were discussed. She remembered her father talking about this as they traveled north, how the land they were going to had belonged to someone before it belonged to the settlers, and how the nation was resolving this question in ways that would take generations to reckon with honestly. She could not fix what was larger than herself, but she could be honest about it, and she was. She could ensure that the people who worked on the Calloway ranch, the Mexican hands who came up from Texas and the homesteaders' sons and the freedmen who had come west after the war looking for different possibilities than the ones the South offered them, were paid fairly and treated with the respect their labor warranted. Silas had always done this, she discovered, from before she was part of the ranch. It was one of the things she had loved in him without knowing it, the implicit belief that the measure of a man was not just in his acres, but in his accounting to the people who worked them. On a warm evening in the summer of 1884, when Daniel was 8 and Sarah was 6 and James was 4, the 5 of them sat on the front porch of the ranch house as the valley went to gold and then to purple below them. The cattle were dark shapes on the far pasture. The creek caught the last of the light and sent it back in pieces. The mountains against the sky were the same mountains that had been there before any of them and would be there after. Daniel was asking about the creek, whether they could swim in it tomorrow, and Sarah was telling him with authority that the swimming hole at the bend was too shallow this time of year because the summer had been dry, and James was ignoring both of them and studying a beetle he had found on the porch rail with the focused scientific attention that was entirely characteristic of him. Silas had his arm around Eliza on the bench, and she leaned against him in the way that had been natural for so long it no longer required any thought at all. She felt the steadiness of him, the familiar solid warmth, and she looked out at the valley that had been her father's dream and was now also hers and also her children's and also this man's beside her. She thought about a Tuesday morning in the autumn of 1874, a bleeding stranger on a fine chestnut horse, and how the whole of this, all the fullness of it, had grown from that single act of taking in who needed taking in, of bringing the stranger inside and doing what had to be done with steady hands and a clear head. She had not known, doing it. She had not known who he was or what he owned or what the future held. She had only known that a man needed help, and she was able to give it. "What are you thinking?" Silas said quietly near her ear in the voice he used only for her, the one underneath the other voices, low and private. "About the day you rode into my yard," she said. She felt him still for a moment beside her. Then his arm tightened slightly around her. "I think about that day," he said, "more than you might suppose." "What do you think about it?" she said. "That I was unconscious for most of the ride, and I cannot account for why the horse brought me to your gate specifically and not to any other in the valley," he said. "I have thought about that many times and I have no answer for it. The horse knew what I did not." She laughed, which was not the response he had been reaching for perhaps, but he laughed too after a moment, the sound of it warm in the evening air, and Daniel looked up from the argument with his sister to ask what was funny, and Sarah demanded to know as well, and James looked at them all with serene disinterest and returned to his beetle. "A very old joke," Silas told them, "from before you were born." "About what?" Daniel demanded. "About a horse with good sense," Eliza said. Daniel considered this. "Old Blue has good sense," he said, speaking of the steady quarter horse he had claimed as his personal property at age 5, in a negotiation with his father that Silas had lost with visible pleasure. "He does," Silas agreed. "The best." Later, when the children had been brought inside and put to bed with the usual combination of stories and authority, and the third glass of water that was always James's particular delaying tactic, when the dishes were washed, and the house was settling into its night sounds, Silas and Eliza sat together by the fire with the comfortable quietness that had become the shape of their evenings. He reached across and took her hand, which he did sometimes without prelude or explanation, just taking it and holding it the way you hold something you do not want to put down. She looked at their hands together in the firelight, his large and roughened by the work of 30 years, her smaller but equally marked by work and time and weather, and she thought that this was the truest picture of them, two working hands holding each other in the warmth. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "Any of it?" She looked at him. The fire was in his eyes, those gray-green eyes that she knew as well as she knew her own name, that she had first seen confused and feverish on her father's cot and had been reading ever since like a landscape she never tired of. "No," she said, without needing to think about it. "Not one moment. Not even the beginning," he said, "when you did not know who I was and I let you not know. Especially not the beginning," she said. "Because in the beginning you were just a man who needed help and I was just a woman who helped you, and we were honest with each other before we were anything else. Even when you were not saying the whole of it, you were not lying. And that mattered." He raised her hand and pressed his lips to it, just as he had done the evening she said yes, on a winter night in her father's small house, and the gesture carried in it all the distance they had traveled since. "I love you, Eliza," he said. "I have loved you from about the third day, I think, when you told me you would prefer not to spend another night with your hands inside me and then very nearly smiled about it." She laughed. "I remember that. You had your whole face under control except the corner of your mouth," he said. "That corner gave you away." "I will work on that," she said. "Please do not," he said. She moved closer to him on the bench beside the fire, and he put his arm around her, and she settled her head against his shoulder. And the fire went on burning, and the wind moved through the valley outside, and the house around them held all of it, the past and the present and the future that was already beginning in the 3 sleeping children in the upstairs rooms. Daniel, who would one day run the ranch with the same care his father had. Sarah, who would grow up to be a doctor. A path she began announcing at age 7, and pursued with the Blackwell stubbornness that went all the way back to her grandfather. James, who would eventually become the kind of man who understood horses so profoundly that people came from 3 counties to have him work with their animals. But all of that was the future, and the future was its own country. And tonight was this: the fire and the hands and the 10 years of a life built together from a chance encounter and a bullet and a woman who had done what needed doing without knowing what it would cost or what it would give her. She would not have changed a single hour of it. The valley outside the windows was dark and full and enormous, running out to the mountains that held the sky, and it was theirs, not in the way of ownership that excludes but in the way of belonging that holds, and they sat together in the middle of it, in the warmth of everything they had built, and the fire burned down slowly and the night went on, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. In the years that followed, the Calloway name became something woven into the history of Sweetwater Valley, not as the name of a family that had conquered the place, but as the name of a family that had been part of it, shaped by it, and shaping it in return, the way a river and its banks are shaped by each other over time. Eliza kept her father's grave tended and his name alive, and Daniel's middle name carried it forward, and the homestead she kept in her own right remained as a living fact of what it meant to belong to a place on your own terms. On the morning of their 10th wedding anniversary, in January of 1885, Silas brought her coffee before she was fully awake, the way he had done on every anniversary and on many ordinary mornings since the beginning, and set it on the table beside the bed and sat on the edge of the mattress with his own cup and looked at her with the expression she had known for 10 years but had never quite stopped being moved by. 10 years, he said. 10 years, she said, sitting up and taking the coffee. And you have not managed to make me regret it yet. I live in hope of eventually annoying you into regret, he said. You are not annoying enough, she said. I have noticed this deficiency in you from the start. I will try harder, he said. Please do not, she said, returning his words from the fireside years ago, and he recognized them and smiled the full smile that she had always loved best, the young open one that he gave only to her and to the children and to very occasionally the horses, which she thought was entirely appropriate company. She set down her coffee and put her hand against the side of his face, and he turned slightly and pressed his lips to her palm, and for a moment they simply stayed like that, still in the early morning, the children not yet stirring, the valley not yet fully lit, everything poised at the quiet edge of another day. Thank you, he said. "For what?" she said. "For the day you brought me in," he said. "For not leaving me in the yard. For the bullet and the broth and the carbolic solution and the mending basket and the 14 years of extraordinary daily life that followed all of it." 14, she said. 14, he agreed. "From the day I rode in. 10 married, 4 of being entirely unable to stay away." She laughed. She put down her coffee and leaned forward and kissed him, and he put his arms around her in the way she had come to think of as home, complete and certain, the truest shelter she had ever known. Outside the windows, Sweetwater Valley was waking up in the pale January light, the frost on the grass catching the first sun and sending it back in 1,000 small sparks, the cattle moving on the far pasture, the creek running clear and cold beneath its winter margins, the mountains standing in their ancient patience at the rim of everything. It was a beautiful valley. It had always been a beautiful valley. It belonged to no one and to everyone who loved it. She breathed it all in from where she sat in the warm room with her husband's arms around her, the smell of the coffee and the cold outside and the wood fire below, and the particular scent of him that she would know in the dark from across a room. She had come to this valley as a child in the back of a wagon, and she had stayed through grief and difficulty and 2 years of solitude, and then a stranger had ridden into her yard on a fine chestnut horse and nearly died in her yard, and she had done what she knew how to do, which was to help, and from that single ordinary act of human decency, the entire extraordinary architecture of her life had been built. She thought her father would have been pleased. She thought he would have sat on the porch in the evening and said that a man, or a woman, could not ask for a finer view to end a day on. She thought he would have shaken Silas Calloway's hand and looked at him with those careful eyes of his that saw clearly and said, not in so many words but with the economy of a man who did not waste, "You will do." From down the hall came the sound of Daniel waking up, the particular noise of a 9-year-old's relationship with consciousness, loud and sudden, and followed immediately by the sound of his feet on the floor. "Good morning is happening," Silas said. "At considerable volume," she agreed. He stood and pulled her to her feet, and they went together to meet the day, as they had done for 10 years and would do for many more, through the seasons of the valley and the seasons of themselves, through everything the future held and everything the past had given them, through the whole long, beautiful, ordinary, extraordinary life of 2 people who had found each other by accident and chosen each other every day since. The door of the bedroom opened onto the hall, and the hall was full of the sounds of the house waking up, and beyond the windows the valley was bright and cold and permanent, and all of it, every last detail of it, was exactly and completely right.